Your mother comes to our house too often. She's suffocating us. Jessica's voice cut through the dining room like something sharp and deliberate, the kind of sentence that doesn't just land. It lingers, hanging in the air long after it's spoken, pressing against your chest in a way you can't quite explain. I was standing at the kitchen island, my hand still wrapped around the ceramic dish I had brought over. Daniel's favorite chicken pot pie, the one I used to make every Sunday when he was a boy. Still warm, still carefully covered with foil, as if that small act of care still meant something here. For a moment no one moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. My grandson, Ethan, sat frozen at the table, his fork halfway to his mouth. Daniel stood by the sink, his back partially turned, but not enough to hide the way his shoulders tightened. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A small laugh maybe. A gentle correction. Just, that's not fair. Something simple. Something human. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring down at the counter like it held the answer to a question he didn't want to ask. Jessica crossed her arms, her expression firm, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced this moment more than once. We need space, she added, her tone calmer now but colder somehow. We're trying to build our own life, and you're always here. Every weekend. Every holiday. Sometimes during the week too. It's too much. I felt the weight of the dish in my hands, heavier now than when I'd carried it from my car. Always here. I tried to replay the past few months in my mind. The birthday dinners I was invited to. The Sunday lunches Daniel had asked me not to miss. The afternoons Jessica herself had texted, asking if I could stop by to watch Ethan while she ran errands. I hadn't realized those invitations had an expiration date. I set the dish down slowly on the counter, careful not to make a sound. My fingers lingered on the edge of it for just a second longer than necessary, as if letting go meant accepting something I wasn't ready to name yet. I didn't realize I was. I started, but the words didn't finish themselves. There wasn't a polite version of this conversation. Not anymore. Jessica exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. That's the problem, she said. You don't realize. I looked at Daniel again. He finally glanced up, just briefly, our eyes meeting for less than a second before he looked away. That was all it took. I understood. It wasn't just her voice in this room. It was his silence too. And somehow that hurt more. I nodded once, a small movement, almost automatic. I see, I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I did. Not completely. Not yet. Ethan shifted in his chair, looking between the three of us, confused in the way children are when something breaks but no one explains what. I forced a small smile in his direction, the kind that doesn't quite reach your eyes. Your dinner's getting cold, I said gently. My voice sounded steady. Surprised me. I reached for my purse, which I had placed neatly by the door when I arrived, the way I always did, as if I belonged here. As if this was still part of my routine. My place. I slipped my coat on slowly, taking my time, not because I needed to, but because I wasn't ready for what came after the door. No one stopped me. No one said, wait. No one said, Mom, she didn't mean it like that. The absence of those words was louder than anything Jessica had said. I paused with my hand on the doorknob just for a second. The house smelled like the pot pie, like the dinners we used to share without tension, without calculation. I wondered how something so familiar could feel so foreign all at once. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, sharper than I expected, brushing against my face like a quiet reminder that things had changed, whether I was ready or not. As I walked to my car, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. That wasn't just a comment. It wasn't a bad day or a moment of frustration. It was a line, and I had just been moved to the other side of it. I got into my car, closed the door and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel, the house still visible through the windshield. The porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow over the front steps I had walked up so many times before. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't go back inside. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle around me. Because somewhere, deep beneath the sting of her words and the weight of his silence, a quieter thought began to form. I had been coming to their house too often. Maybe that part was true, but not for the reasons she thought. And as I started the engine and drove away, I realized something else. That had been the last time I walked into my son's house as a mother who still believed she belonged there. I did not drive straight home. I told myself that I would take the usual route, make a cup of tea, and sit in my quiet living room the way I always did after visiting Daniel's house. But my hands kept the wheel steady while my mind wandered somewhere else entirely. The streets looked the same as they always had, the same grocery store on the corner, the same gas station with the flickering sign, the same row of houses with warm lights glowing behind curtains, but everything felt slightly out of place, like I was seeing it all from a distance I could not quite close. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long moment, the engine still running, the soft hum filling the silence that had followed me home. My house greeted me the way it always did, unchanged and patient, as if it had been waiting for me to return without question, without condition. I stepped inside and placed my purse on the small wooden table by the door, the same spot it had rested for years. The air inside carried that familiar scent of lavender and old books, something steady, something reliable. I slipped off my coat and hung it carefully, smoothing the fabric out of habit, as if small acts of order could still hold everything else together. In the kitchen, the light above the sink cast a soft glow across the countertops. Everything was exactly where I had left it earlier that afternoon. The kettle, the neatly folded dish towel, the small bowl of fruit I had not touched in days. It was quiet. Not the heavy silence from before, but a different kind, one that did not press against me, only surrounded me. I moved slowly, opening the refrigerator, placing the leftover groceries inside, noticing how empty it looked compared to the one at Daniel's house, always full, always busy. I closed the door gently and leaned my hands against the counter, letting the cool surface ground me. I did not cry. The feeling had not reached that point yet. It stayed somewhere deeper, quieter, like a realization that had not fully introduced itself. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, watching the small blue flame come to life beneath it. The routine felt familiar, almost comforting, but there was something different in the way I moved, a slight hesitation, as if I was relearning a space I had once known perfectly. As I waited for the water to heat, my eyes drifted to the small framed photographs lined along the wall. Daniel at 5 years old, missing his front teeth and smiling proudly in a baseball uniform 2 sizes too big. Daniel at 16, taller than me already, standing in the driveway with his first car, the one I helped him buy after saving for months. Daniel on his wedding day, standing beside Jessica, his expression bright, hopeful, full of something I had believed in at the time. I walked over and picked up that last frame, my fingers tracing the edge of it lightly. I remembered that day clearly. The way Jessica had hugged me and said, "I am so lucky to be joining this family." The way Daniel had looked at me during the ceremony, just for a second, as if to say thank you without using words. I had believed that moment meant something permanent, something unshakable. I placed the frame back down carefully, aligning it with the others. The kettle began to whistle softly, pulling me back into the present. I poured the hot water into my favorite mug, the one with a small chip along the rim, and carried it to the living room. The couch welcomed me the way it always did, the cushions soft and familiar. I sat down slowly, holding the mug in both hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. The house was still. No voices. No tensión. No waiting for the right moment to speak. I took a small sip of tea and stared ahead, not really looking at anything in particular. It was then that something began to settle into place. Not a sudden realization, not a sharp moment of clarity, but a quiet understanding that unfolded piece by piece. I thought about the past year. The times I had been asked to come over. The times I had been told not to. The way invitations had become less frequent, then more conditional. Maybe next week. We are busy this weekend. Let me check with Jessica. I thought about the small pauses in Daniel's voice during our phone calls, the way he would hesitate before answering simple questions, as if measuring his words against something I could not hear. I had noticed those things. Of course I had. But I had explained them away. Work stress. A busy household. A young family trying to find its rhythm. I had chosen the kindest explanations because they were easier to live with. I set the mug down on the coffee table and leaned back into the couch, exhaling slowly. It was not just tonight. Tonight had simply been the first time it was said out loud. Clear. Direct. Unmistakable. I was not being invited into their lives anymore. I had been tolerated, managed, scheduled, and now finally removed. The word suffocating echoed quietly in my mind, not with anger, but with a strange kind of detachment. I tried to see myself the way she must have seen me. A presence that lingered too long. A voice that appeared too often. A reminder of something they were trying to move beyond. It did not match the person I believed I was, but that did not seem to matter anymore. What mattered was that it was real to her. And somehow it had become real to him too. I sat there in the stillness, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the tea growing cooler beside me. The house did not ask anything of me. It did not require me to explain myself or adjust my presence. It simply existed, steady and unchanged. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to consider something I had not thought about before. If I had been too much for them, then perhaps I had been giving too much as well. Not just my time, but my attention, my effort, my quiet willingness to be available whenever they needed me. I had built my days around their lives without ever noticing how little space was left for my own. I looked around the room again, this time seeing it differently. Not as a place I returned to after visiting them, but as a place that had always been mine, waiting patiently while I stepped in and out of someone else's world. And as that thought settled in, calm and steady, I realized that nothing had actually been taken from me tonight. Something had simply been revealed. And now that I could finally see it clearly, I understood that what came next would not be about going back. It would be about deciding whether I ever needed to go there again at all. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the light slipping quietly through the curtains as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not shifted its shape the night before. But I woke up earlier than usual, my eyes opening before the alarm, my body already aware that something inside me had settled into a new rhythm. I lay there for a few seconds staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house, and for the first time in a long while, I noticed that I was not waiting for anything. No message. No call. No plan that depended on someone else's schedule. I sat up slowly, placing my feet on the floor, feeling the cool wood beneath them, grounding steady. The day stretched ahead of me, empty in a way that might have once felt lonely, but now felt different, almost unfamiliar in its openness. I made my bed carefully, smoothing the sheets the way I always had, small routines that gave shape to time. In the kitchen, I prepared breakfast without rushing, 2 eggs, a slice of toast, and a cup of coffee, nothing elaborate, nothing performative, just enough. I sat at the table and ate quietly, not distracted, not checking my phone, not thinking about whether I needed to leave soon to make it across town in time for someone else's dinner. The absence of that pressure felt strange at first, like a missing habit I had not realized I depended on. After breakfast, I cleaned the dishes and stood by the sink for a moment, looking out at the small backyard. The trees were still, the morning air clear. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I felt as though I was seeing it for the first time in years. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the house, not out of necessity, but out of observation. I opened drawers I had not touched in months, straightened shelves that did not need straightening, paused in rooms I usually passed through without noticing. In the hallway closet, I found a small box tucked behind a stack of blankets. Inside were old cards, drawings, and photographs, pieces of a life that had once been centered entirely around raising Daniel. I sat on the floor and looked through them one by one. A handmade card with uneven handwriting that read, "Best Mom Ever." A drawing of a stick figure family labeled carefully, me, him, and a small dog we had when he was younger. A photograph of us at the county fair, both of us smiling into the sun, his arm wrapped tightly around mine as if letting go was not an option. I held that picture a little longer than the others. It was not the image itself that lingered, but the feeling attached to it, the certainty that existed in that moment, the quiet understanding that I was needed, that I belonged in a way that was not conditional. I placed the items back into the box carefully, closing the lid with both hands, as if sealing something gently rather than hiding it away. By the afternoon, I realized that my phone had not made a sound all day. Not a call. Not a message. I noticed it, but I did not reach for it. I did not feel the urge to check if I had missed something. If anything, the silence confirmed what I had already begun to understand. When the connection had been real, it had not required constant effort to maintain. It had simply existed. I stepped outside onto the porch, letting the fresh air settle around me, and sat in the chair near the railing. The neighborhood moved at its usual pace, a car passing by, a neighbor walking their dog, distant sounds of someone mowing a lawn. Ordinary life continued, steady and predictable. I folded my hands in my lap and let my thoughts move without forcing them into any particular direction. Pieces of the past surfaced, small moments I had once dismissed as unimportant. The time Jessica had rearranged the kitchen cabinets without mentioning it, moving everything I had known by instinct into unfamiliar places. The way Daniel had laughed it off when I mentioned it, saying, "It is her house too, Mom." The time I had shown up with groceries only to find the door locked and the curtains drawn, even though I had been told they would be home. The way Jessica had later said they had stepped out, her tone light, casual, as if the inconvenience was mine alone. At the time I had adjusted. I had told myself that households change, that new families create their own patterns, that it was natural for things to shift. I had not considered that those shifts might be intentional, that they might be guiding me slowly, gently toward the edges. I sat there for a long while, letting those memories settle into place, not as accusations, not as something to confront, but as pieces of a pattern that had finally become visible. The realization did not bring anger. It brought clarity. And with clarity came something quieter, something steadier than the uncertainty I had carried for months. I was not being pushed away suddenly. I had been moving in that direction for some time. I had simply chosen not to see it. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting a softer light across the street, I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment. There was no urgency in me anymore. No need to fix anything, no impulse to call and smooth things over. That part of me, the one that rushed to maintain peace, to preserve connection at any cost, had grown quieter. In its place was something else. Not distance. Not indifference. Just a quiet understanding that I no longer needed to prove my place in a space that had already decided I did not belong. And as that understanding settled fully, I realized that the question was no longer whether I would be invited back. It was whether I would ever accept that invitation again. I did not call Daniel that day, and he did not call me. The silence between us was not dramatic or loud. It simply existed, steady and uninterrupted, as if it had always been there waiting for me to finally notice it. By the second day I realized something else. I had built my routines around him for so long that I could measure time by the moments I used to prepare for him. Tuesdays were for grocery shopping, picking up the things he liked, even if he did not ask for them anymore. Saturdays were for cooking meals I would bring over, always in containers I never seemed to get back. Sundays were for waiting, not always for a visit, but for the possibility of one. That quiet expectation had shaped my entire week without me realizing it. Now those spaces remained, but the purpose behind them had disappeared. I stood in my kitchen that morning holding a shopping list I had written the night before, and for the first time I looked at it differently. Every item on that list had his name attached to it in some way. The brand of cereal he preferred. The specific kind of bread Jessica once mentioned liking. Snacks for Ethan. None of it was for me. I folded the paper slowly and placed it back on the counter. I did not throw it away. I simply left it there unfinished, like something that no longer needed to be completed. Instead I made a shorter list. Simpler. Things I actually used. It felt unfamiliar. Choosing for myself without considering anyone else's preferences, but not uncomfortable. Just new. When I went to the store later that morning, I noticed how different it felt to walk through the aisles without rushing. I did not check my phone. I did not calculate how long I could stay before needing to leave for someone else's schedule. I moved slowly, stopping when something caught my attention, picking things up without thinking about whether anyone else would like them. At the checkout, the cashier smiled politely and asked how my day was going. "It is quiet," I said, and that was the truth. Not sad. Not lonely. Just quiet. When I returned home, I carried the bags inside and placed them on the counter, unpacking them one by one. There was no urgency, no pressure to get everything ready before heading out again. The day belonged entirely to me, and I was still learning what that meant. In the afternoon, I sat at the dining table with a notebook I had not opened in years. It had once been filled with plans, reminders, small lists of things I needed to do for Daniel when he was younger. Doctor appointments, school events, deadlines for forms and payments. My handwriting filled the pages with careful detail, every line organized around his needs. I turned to a blank page and held the pen in my hand, unsure of what to write. It seemed like a simple thing, but I realized I had not written anything down for myself in a very long time. After a moment, I wrote a single sentence. What do I want my days to look like? The question sat there, simple and direct, but it felt heavier than it should have. I stared at it for a while, letting it settle. I did not rush to answer it. Some questions needed time before they could be understood. As the hours passed, more memories surfaced, not in sharp flashes, but in quiet sequences that connected more clearly now than they ever had before. The time Daniel told me they were thinking about moving but never mentioned where. The way Jessica had said, "We will let you know," but never did. The way I had waited for updates that never came, convincing myself they were just busy. I had been included in their lives in ways that were convenient, but never in ways that were essential. And I had accepted that without questioning it. Not because I did not notice, but because I chose not to see what it meant. I had believed that love was something that adjusted, something that made space even when space was not offered. But sitting there in the quiet of my own home, I began to understand that love without boundaries did not create closeness. It created imbalance. An imbalance over time becomes distance. I closed the notebook gently and placed it in front of me, my hand resting on the cover. The question I had written was still there, waiting, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Felt like a beginning. Not of something dramatic or sudden, but of something steady. Something that belonged to me. That evening I prepared dinner for myself, a simple meal, nothing elaborate, but I set the table anyway. One plate. One glass. One chair pulled out. I sat down and ate slowly, not distracted, not thinking about who was missing, but aware of who was present. Myself. It was a small realization, but carried a quiet kind of weight. For so long, I had measured my worth by how needed I was in someone else's life. By how often I was called. How frequently I was included. But now, sitting there alone, I began to see that being needed and being valued were not always the same thing. And as I cleared the table and washed the dishes, I noticed something else. I was not waiting anymore. Not for a phone call. Not for an apology. Not for permission to return. Whatever had been decided in that house the night before had already set something in motion. But what they had not realized was that it had not only removed me from their space. It had given me back something I had been slowly losing for years. My own place in my life. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. On the third day, the phone finally rang. It was not a dramatic moment. No sudden rush of emotion. No instinct to run toward it. I was in the living room, folding a blanket I had taken out the night before, my movements slow and deliberate, when the sound broke the quiet. I glanced at the screen. Daniel. The name sat there, familiar and distant at the same time. For a second I simply looked at it, not reaching, not reacting, just observing the way it made me feel. It was not relief. It was not anger. It was something in between, something steadier. I let it ring twice more before I picked it up. "Hello," I said, my voice even, calm in a way that surprised me. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to feel intentional. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone casual, almost careful, as if he was testing the space between us before stepping into it. I waited. I did not fill the silence for him the way I used to. "I just wanted to check in," he continued. "Make sure you got home okay the other night." The other night. He did not name it. He did not repeat what had been said. He did not acknowledge the weight of it. It was already being softened, reduced to something smaller, something easier to move past. "I did," I replied. Another pause. I could hear faint sounds in the background, a television maybe, or movement from another room. Life continuing on his side without interruption. "Listen," he said after a moment. Things got a little tense. Jessica was just stressed. You know how things can get. I did not respond right away. Not because I did not understand what he was saying, but because I understood it too well. This was how it had always been handled. Not directly. Not honestly. Just enough explanation to smooth the surface without addressing what lay underneath. "I see," I said finally, the same words I had used before, but they felt different now. He exhaled, a small release of tension. "We just need a little space right now," he added. "Nothing personal. Just trying to figure things out. Nothing personal. I let that settle for a moment. The phrase sounded simple, almost reasonable, but it carried a quiet contradiction. How could something like that not be personal? I had been part of his life for 42 years. There was nothing in that history that could be separated so easily. Of course, I said. My tone did not change. I did not question him. I did not ask what that space meant or how long it would last. I did not ask when I would see him again. I had asked those questions in other ways in other moments, and I already knew the answers would not be clear. We will call you soon, he said, as if offering reassurance, though it felt more like a closing statement. Take care, Mom. You too, I replied. The call ended quietly. No raised voices. No conflict. Just a conversation that left everything exactly where it had been, only clearer now. I set the phone down on the table and stood there for a moment, my hand resting beside it. The room was still. The same quiet that had been there before the call returned without hesitation, as if nothing had interrupted it at all. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, watching as a car passed slowly by, its tires humming softly against the pavement. Daniel's words replayed in my mind, not as accusations but as confirmations. Space. Stress. Nothing personal. Each one carefully chosen. Each one designed to create distance without responsibility. I had heard those kinds of words before, just in different forms. They were not new. They had simply become more direct. I folded my arms lightly, not out of discomfort but out of thought. For years I had adjusted myself to fit into their lives. I had arrived when invited, stepped back when asked, changed my habits without question, all in the name of keeping things peaceful, keeping things connected. I had believed that flexibility was a form of love, that making myself smaller would make space for something larger to grow. But now, standing there in the quiet of my own home, I began to see that what I had called flexibility had slowly turned into something else. Something closer to erasure. I had not been asked to leave all at once. I had been moved step by step, until there was no place left for me to stand. And now, finally, it had been said out loud. We need space. I nodded to myself slightly, not in agreement but in recognition. If space was what they wanted, then space was what they would have. Not the kind that leaves a door open waiting to be invited back. Not the kind that lingers hoping to be needed again. A different kind. The kind that exists without expectation. I turned away from the window and walked back into the room, my steps steady, my thoughts quiet but certain. For the first time since the call ended, I picked up my phone again, not to return it, not to send a message, but to turn it face down on the table. A small action. Simple. Final in its own way. Because I understood something now that I had not allowed myself to fully accept before. This was not a temporary distance. It was a decision. And if they had made theirs, then it was time for me to make mine. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that felt unfamiliar. Not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, like something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface had finally settled into place. I moved through the house the same way I had the past few days, slow, deliberate, aware of each small action as if it carried more meaning now than it used to. I made my coffee, stood by the window, and watched the early light stretch across the yard. But there was something different in the way I held myself, a quiet sense of direction where there had once been hesitation. I was no longer waiting to see what they would do next. I already knew. And that changed everything. After breakfast, I walked into the small room at the back of the house, the one I had always referred to as the study, though I rarely used it for anything other than storing paperwork and old files. The desk sat exactly as it had for years, neat, untouched, almost formal in its stillness. I pulled out the chair and sat down, my hands resting on the surface for a moment before I opened the top drawer. Inside were folders, documents, envelopes, all organized carefully, the way I had always kept them. Bills. Insurance papers. Property records. Things that had never seemed urgent, only necessary. I reached for a folder labeled with the address of Daniel's house and placed it in front of me. For a few seconds I simply looked at it, my fingers resting lightly on the edge, as if acknowledging something I had not fully considered before. I opened it slowly. The papers inside were exactly where I had left them, unchanged, waiting. The purchase agreement. The loan documents. The records of payments made over the years. My name was on every page. Not his. Not theirs. Mine. I remembered the day we bought that house. Daniel had been so proud walking through each room, talking about plans, about building a future there with Jessica. He had not been able to qualify for the full loan on his own at the time, not with the business just starting and the income still uncertain. So I had stepped in without hesitation. It had not felt like a decision. It had felt like something a mother does. Support. Stability. A foundation. I had signed the documents without asking for anything in return, without setting conditions, without imagining a future where those details might matter. I closed the folder gently and leaned back in the chair, my gaze settling on the wall in front of me. The room was quiet, the same kind of quiet that had followed me for days now, but it no longer felt empty. It felt focused. I understood something now that I had not allowed myself to fully see before. The space they had asked for was not just emotional. It was physical. It was practical. It was about control. Control over their home, their lives, their boundaries. And until now, I had been the one holding something they needed without even realizing it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I looked older than I remembered, not in a way that felt heavy, but in a way that felt honest. Time had passed. Things had changed. And I had not changed with them. I had stayed in a role that no longer existed, holding on to a version of the past that had quietly been replaced. I turned back to the desk and placed the folder neatly in the center. My movements were calm, precise, not rushed. This was not about anger. It was not about proving anything. It was about understanding the reality of what stood in front of me, and deciding what to do with it. I reached for another document, one I had not looked at in years, and read through it carefully line by line, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it clearly this time, without assumptions, without emotion. When I finished, I placed it back into the folder and closed it, pressing my hand gently against the cover for a moment. That house. The place I had walked into so many times, believing I was welcome, believing I was part of something shared. It had never fully belonged to them. Not in the way they thought. And yet, I had treated it as if it did, stepping carefully, adjusting myself, respecting boundaries that had never been formally mine to respect. I had given them that authority without question. I let out a slow breath and picked up the folder, carrying it with me as I left the room. I did not hesitate. I did not second guess. The decision had already been made, not in a single moment, but over the course of everything that had led here. The words, the silence, the distance, the clarity that followed. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and reached for my phone, turning it over in my hand before unlocking it. I scrolled briefly, not searching for a message, not checking for missed calls, but simply moving past what no longer held my attention. Then I selected a number I had not used in a long time. The office of the attorney who had handled the original purchase. I pressed call and lifted the phone to my ear, my posture straight, my voice steady when it connected. "Good morning," I said. "I would like to schedule a meeting." There was no hesitation in my tone, no uncertainty, only clarity. Because for the first time I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. The attorney's office had not changed much since the last time I had been there. The same quiet lobby, the same soft lighting, the same sense of order that made everything feel deliberate and contained. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, but because I no longer rushed from one obligation to another. Time had become something I moved through, not something I chased. The receptionist greeted me politely, asked me to take a seat, and I did, placing my hands neatly in my lap as I waited. There was no anxiety in me, no second thoughts about why I was there. Only a calm awareness that this was a necessary step, one I should have taken much sooner. When my name was called, I stood and followed her down the hallway, each step steady, measured, the sound of my shoes against the floor the only thing breaking the quiet. The office itself felt familiar, lined with shelves of files and framed certificates that spoke of years of careful work. Mr. Collins stood as I entered, offering a small, professional smile. "It has been a while," he said. "What can I help you with today?" I took a seat across from his desk and placed the folder in front of me, my fingers resting lightly on it before I slid it toward him. "I would like to review the ownership in terms of the Whitmore property," I said, my voice even without hesitation. He nodded, opening the folder and scanning the documents with practiced eyes. There was a brief silence as he read, the kind that allows truth to settle without interruption. "Everything appears to be in your name," he said after a moment. "You are the sole legal owner of the property. Your son and his wife are listed as occupants, not owners." I nodded once. I already knew that. But hearing it said aloud carried a different kind of weight, something more grounded, more final. "What are my options?" I asked. He looked at me carefully then, as if measuring not just the question, but the reason behind it. "That depends on what you want to accomplish," he replied. "You could transfer ownership, establish a formal rental agreement, or request that the property be vacated. There are also options in between, depending on how you wish to proceed." I listened without interrupting, my hands still, my posture unchanged. Each option laid itself out clearly. Not complicated, not dramatic, just practical choices. Real ones. For so long, I had acted as if I did not have any. "If I choose to request that they vacate," I said slowly, "what would that involve?" He explained the process in simple terms. Notices. Timelines. Legal protections. Everything structured, everything clear. There was no emotion in it. Just steps. I appreciated that. Emotion had clouded enough already. When he finished, I nodded again, not because I needed more time to think, but because I had already thought about it. Not in this room, not with these words, but in the quiet days that had led me here. "I would like to proceed," I said. My voice did not rise. It did not waver. It simply existed, steady and certain. He studied me for a brief moment, then nodded in return. "Very well. I will prepare the necessary documents. You will need to review and sign them before we move forward." "Thank you," I replied. There was nothing more to add. The meeting concluded without urgency, without tension. Just an agreement to act. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon light felt different. Not brighter, not warmer, just clearer. As if something had shifted in the way I saw it. I walked to my car and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my reflection faint in the glass. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindictive. Those emotions had no place here. What I felt was something quieter. A sense of alignment between what had been done and what would now be done in response. Later that evening, as I sat in my living room, the documents no longer in my hands but already in motion, I allowed myself to think about Daniel again. Not as the boy in the photographs. Not as the version of him I had held on to for years. But as he was now. A man who had made his choices. A man who had asked for space. I had given him that. Fully. Completely. In a way he had not expected. I leaned back in my chair, the room around me calm, unchanged, and for the first time since that night, I understood something with complete clarity. This was not about taking something away from them. It was about no longer giving something they believed they already owned. And as that understanding settled, firm and unshaken, I realized that whatever came next would not be driven by anger or hurt. It would be driven by something far simpler. Balance. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt exactly right. The documents arrived 2 days later, delivered in a plain envelope that looked no different from any other piece of mail. Yet I recognized immediately that it carried something far more significant than its appearance suggested. I placed it on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment, looking at it without opening it, not out of hesitation but out of acknowledgement. This was not an impulsive decision. It was not something done in reaction to a single moment. It was the result of everything that had been said and everything that had not. I sat down slowly and opened the envelope, removing the papers carefully, smoothing them out in front of me. The language was precise, structured, clear in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Notice of termination of occupancy. A timeline for vacating the property. Instructions that were not emotional, not personal, just factual. I read through each page once, then again, not searching for doubt, but confirming what I already understood. My name appeared where it always had. The authority I had never questioned was now being used in a way I had never imagined. I reached for a pen and held it between my fingers for a brief moment, feeling the weight of something that was both simple and final. Then I signed. My hand did not shake. The line was clean, steady. exactly as it had been years ago when I signed to give him that house. Only now the intention was different. I placed the pen down and gathered the papers neatly, aligning the edges before sliding them back into the envelope. There was no dramatic feeling attached to the act. No surge of emotion. Just a quiet sense of completion. Later that afternoon I drove to the post office, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. The drive was calm, the roads familiar, the same route I had taken countless times before for errands that had once felt routine. But this time I was not thinking about what needed to be done afterward. I was present in the moment, aware of each turn, each stoplight, each small detail that passed by. When I arrived, I parked and sat for a second, my hand resting lightly on the envelope. Then I picked it up and stepped out of the car. Inside, the post office was quiet, only a few people in line, the soft hum of conversation blending into the background. I waited my turn, holding the envelope steadily, not shifting it from hand to hand, not fidgeting. When I reached the counter, I placed it down and asked for it to be sent with confirmation of delivery. The clerk nodded, processed it without question, and handed me a receipt. I thanked her and turned to leave, the transaction completed as simply as any other. Outside, the air felt the same as it had that morning. Neither warmer nor colder, just consistent. I walked back to my car and sat down, placing the receipt in the small compartment near the console. The envelope was no longer beside me. It was already on its way. I did not check my phone. I did not anticipate the reaction. Whatever response came would come in its own time. My role in this part of the process was finished. That evening, I returned to my usual routine, preparing dinner, setting the table, moving through the house with the same steady rhythm I had come to recognize as my own. The difference was not in what I was doing but in how I felt while doing it. There was no lingering uncertainty, no question about whether I had gone too far or not far enough. The decision had been made with clarity, and clarity does not require constant reconsideration. As the days passed, I noticed the quiet in a different way. It was no longer something I observed. It was something I inhabited. My time unfolded without interruption, without expectation, without the subtle tension of waiting for something outside of myself to happen. And then on the fourth day the phone rang again. I was in the living room reading when the sound broke through the stillness. I looked at the screen. Daniel. I let it ring once, twice, the same way I had before, then I picked it up. Hello, I said, my voice calm, unchanged. This time there was no pause on the other end. No careful testing of tone. His voice came quickly, tighter than before, carrying something he was not trying to hide. Mom, what is this? He asked. I knew immediately what he meant. The envelope had arrived. The words had been read. The reality had settled. I did not answer right away. Not because I did not have an answer, but because I did not need to rush to give it. I allowed the silence to exist between us for a moment, the same kind of silence that had once worked against me, now simply part of the conversation. It is a notice, I said finally, my tone steady, factual. Nothing more. Nothing less. There was a sharp exhale on the other end, a shift in his breathing that spoke louder than his words. You are asking us to leave? He said, the question direct now, stripped of the softness from before. Yes, I replied. No explanation. No apology. Just the truth exactly as it was. The line went quiet for a second, but this time it was not an empty silence. It was a filled one, heavy with the weight of something he had not expected to face. And for the first time since this all began, I understood that the space they had asked for had finally taken shape in a way they could no longer ignore. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, longer than any silence we had shared before, but this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt heavy, grounded, as if something that had been abstract to him had suddenly taken a concrete form. Mom, you cannot be serious, Daniel said finally, his voice lower now, less controlled, as if the words had slipped out before he could adjust them. I remained still, the phone held comfortably against my ear, my gaze resting on the window in front of me where the late afternoon light had begun to fade into something softer. I am, I replied. My tone did not change. There was no need for emphasis. The truth did not require it. I heard movement on his end, footsteps perhaps, a door closing, the faint sound of something being set down with more force than necessary. He was reacting now, not with the careful distance he had used before, but with something closer to urgency. "This is our home," he said. The word "our" lingered, stretched, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. I let that settle for a moment before answering. "It is the house you live in," I said quietly. "There is a difference." Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. "You never had a problem with it before," he continued. "You were the one who wanted us to have it. You said you wanted us to build our life there." I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. "I did," I said. "And I meant it." That part was still true. Nothing about what I had done then had been dishonest. It had been given freely, without conditions, without expectation. But that did not mean it existed without limits. "Then why are you doing this?" he asked, the question direct now, stripped of the last layer of restraint. I did not answer immediately. Not because I did not know, but because I wanted the words to be as clear as everything else had become. "Because you asked for space," I said finally. The line went quiet again, but this time I could feel the shift, the way the meaning of that word returned to him, not as something casual, but as something he had said, something he had meant, even if he had not understood the full weight of it. "That is not what I meant," he said quickly. "You know that is not what I meant." I held the phone a little more firmly, not in tension but in certainty. "You said I was suffocating you," I replied. "You said I was there too often. That my presence was too much." My voice remained calm, not accusatory, not emotional, just reflective. I listened. I could hear his breathing now, uneven, searching for something to hold on to. "Mom, we just needed boundaries," he said. "That is all. Not this. This is extreme." I almost smiled, not out of humor but out of recognition. Boundaries. The word sounded familiar but different now, spoken from the other side. "Boundaries work both ways," I said gently. "You created yours. I am creating mine." There was no anger in me, no desire to hurt him, only a quiet alignment between what had been said and what now followed. On his end, I heard Jessica's voice faintly in the background, asking something I could not fully make out, but I did not need to. I knew she was there. I knew this conversation would not stay between us. "So that is it?" Daniel asked, his voice tightening again. "You are just taking everything back?" I leaned back slightly in my chair, my eyes still on the fading light outside. "I am not taking anything back," I said. "I am stepping out of a space where I was not wanted." The words settled between us, simple, unforced, carrying more weight than if I had raised my voice or argued. There was another silence, but this one felt different. Not tense, not uncertain, just still. "We have nowhere else to go right now," he said after a moment, and for the first time, there was something softer in his voice, not quite vulnerability but something close to it. I closed my eyes briefly, not to escape the moment but to feel it clearly. This was the part that would have changed everything before. The part where I would have adjusted, softened, stepped back from whatever decision I had made to make things easier for him. But that version of me had already been left behind. "You have time," I said. "The notice explains everything." My tone remained steady, not unkind but not yielding. I opened my eyes again, the room around me quiet, unchanged. "You will figure it out," I added, not as a challenge but as a statement of fact. He did not respond right away. And when he did, his voice was different again, not sharp, not soft, just uncertain. "I do not understand you," he said. I let a small breath out, almost a sigh, though it carried no frustration. "I know," I replied. And that was the truth. He did not understand. Not because I had changed suddenly, but because I had finally stopped being the version of myself he had learned to expect. The line stayed open for another second, then two, neither of us speaking, until he ended the call without another word. I lowered the phone slowly and placed it on the table beside me, my hand resting near it but not touching it again. The house was quiet, the same steady quiet that had become familiar, but now it felt complete. Not empty, not waiting, just settled. I sat there for a while, watching as the last of the daylight faded completely, the room gradually shifting into evening. And in that stillness I understood something with absolute clarity. They had asked for space because they believed it would give them control. What they had not realized was that space, when given fully, does not just remove a presence. It reveals the truth of what remains. And for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer part of something that needed to be negotiated, managed, or earned. I was simply where I belonged. In my own life. On my own terms.